They were 6 years old. They wore matching dresses. They laughed with the kind of joy that only children carry, the sort of sound that fills a backyard and spills over fences and makes the whole neighborhood feel alive. Their names were Amber, Renee, and little Maya, 3 identical girls, born together, raised together, inseparable in every way that mattered. And then, on a warm Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1980, they were gone. No screaming, no struggle, no note left behind, no stranger seen lurking near the fence. Just a backyard swing still rocking gently in the breeze, 3 small pairs of shoes left beside the steps, and a gate, slightly, almost casually, pushed open. Their mother, Carol Hargrove, had been inside the house. She was making lunch. She remembers putting the bread on the counter. She remembers thinking she would call them in from the yard in just a few more minutes. She remembers the particular slant of afternoon light coming through the kitchen window, golden and ordinary and completely unaware of what was already happening just outside that door. When she stepped onto the porch, the yard was empty. She called their names. The sound of her own voice came back to her like something hollow. She called again. Silence. 3 little girls. Gone. And for 28 years, no one, not the police, not the town, not even the reporters who flooded that quiet street, truly understood what had happened. Until the day their father opened something he had sworn never to touch again. This is that story. And before it is over, you will understand something deeply unsettling about the nature of grief, about the masks people wear, and about how close the truth can live to the surface for decades, while everyone searches everywhere else. What if the person searching the hardest for your children was the very one who knew exactly where they were? The town of Delwood, Georgia sat at the edge of nothing in particular. It was the kind of small American place that existed in thousands of forms across the country in 1980. A main street with a hardware store and a diner, a water tower painted with a high school mascot, neighborhoods of modest brick homes with wide lawns and chain-link fences and above-ground pools in the backyards. The Hargrove family lived at 4412 Cedar Mill Road. It was a pleasant enough house. 2 stories, a covered porch, a yard large enough for children to play in, bordered on 2 sides by thick hedgerows and on the back by a wooden fence that separated the property from a date lane used mostly by the Hendersons next door to bring in their riding mower. Raymond Hargrove, the father, was 34 years old that summer. He worked as an account manager at a small insurance firm on the edge of town. He drove a blue Bic Regal. He coached the church softball team on Saturdays. He was, by every account gathered in those first days after the disappearance, a perfectly ordinary man. Carol, his wife, was 32. She had left a job as a school teacher 2 years earlier when the demands of raising identical triplets had made working nearly impossible. She was the one who remembered every birthday of every child of the girls' playgroup. She was the one who sewed their matching dresses. She was the one who read to them every night, 3 small bodies pressed against her. The book always the same one, a worn copy of Bedtime for Francis that they requested again and again. Amber, Renee, and Maya had turned 6 in March of 1980. They were entering 1st grade in the fall. They were learning to write their names in big, uneven letters. They were obsessed, that summer, with a plastic tea set and a particular game that involved setting up chairs in the backyard and hosting elaborate dinner parties for invisible guests. On July 22, 1980, Carol put a pot of tomato soup on the stove and set 2 slices of bread on the counter for sandwiches. The girls were outside. She could hear them, faintly, through the open kitchen window, laughing, talking to each other in the overlapping, finishing each other's sentences way that triplets often develop. She turned away to get the cheese from the refrigerator. The laughing stopped. At first she did not notice. Silence between children is not unusual. They were probably just absorbed in something, setting up the tea set, reorganizing the invisible guest list. She finished making the sandwiches. She ladled the soup. She carried the tray to the back door and pushed it open with her hip. The chairs were knocked sideways. The tea set was scattered across the grass. The gate at the back of the yard, the gate that was always latched because of the lane beyond it, was hanging open, and the girls were gone. Carol Hargrove would later tell investigators that the worst part was not the screaming she did, not the running up and down the lane calling their names until her throat was raw. The worst part was that initial second, that one impossible second before her brain understood what she was looking at. The second when the yard was just a yard. When the knocked-over chairs were just knocked-over chairs. The second before she knew. By 4 in the afternoon, Cedar Mill Road was full of police cruisers. By 5, neighbors had formed a search party. By 6, the local television affiliate had sent a camera crew. And by the time the Georgia Bureau of Investigation arrived the following morning, the case of the missing Hargrove triplets had become the biggest story the town of Delwood had ever witnessed. The search was massive and methodical. Officers and volunteers combed the woods behind the neighborhood, a stretch of scrub pine and kudzu-covered land that ran for nearly half a mile before hitting a county road. Tracking dogs were brought in from the sheriff's department in a neighboring county. They picked up a scent near the gate, followed it down the dirt lane, and then, abruptly, inexplicably, lost it entirely near the road. The lead investigator on the case was a seasoned detective named Walt Presley, a 20-year veteran of the GBI who had worked missing children cases before. He was careful and thorough and deeply troubled by what he found, or rather, by what he did not find. No signs of forced entry anywhere on the property. No tire tracks on the lane that didn't belong to the Henderson family's vehicles. No footprints belonging to anyone other than the girls, and, on older ground near the fence, what appeared to be the print of a single adult work boot. But the soil was too disturbed to make a useful cast. No ransom note arrived. No call came in. The FBI was notified. A tip line was established. Hundreds of calls flooded in over the following days. The usual mix of genuine concern and confusion and the strange, sad need some people have to be part of a tragedy. Every lead was followed. None of them went anywhere. Raymond Hargrove arrived home from work 20 minutes after Carol called him. He was, by all accounts, immediately devastated. He embraced Carol. He wept. He spoke with police that evening in a long, rambling interview that covered everything he could remember about the day. His morning routine, his drive to work, his lunch, his afternoon. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. But there was one moment that Detective Presley would write down in his notes that night and underline twice. When the suggestion was made, gently, as was standard procedure in those days, that Raymond might agree to take a polygraph examination, just to help eliminate him as a suspect so the investigation could focus elsewhere. Raymond Hargrove had gone very still. Then he had said, quietly but firmly, "I find that insulting." And he had said nothing further on the subject. Presley noted it. He noted it because he had asked this question many times, and the range of responses was wide. Some people broke down. Some got angry. Some agreed immediately. Some asked questions about what it involved. But Raymond's response was different. It was controlled. It was measured. And the word he chose, insulting, was interesting. Not hurtful. Not upsetting. Insulting. As though the suggestion were an affront to his dignity rather than a wound to his heart. But there was no evidence. And without evidence, suspicion is just a feeling. The investigation continued. The weeks passed. The girls did not come home. In the weeks that followed the disappearance, something strange emerged that Presley would spend years turning over in his mind. A neighbor, a retired school teacher named Dorothy Ames, who lived 2 houses down from the Hargroves, had initially told a responding officer something that caught his attention. She had been sitting on her front porch that afternoon, she said, around the time the girls were believed to have vanished. She thought she might have seen a truck, a dark-colored pickup, maybe brown or black, parked partway down the dirt lane behind the houses. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. People occasionally parked back there, but after the girls went missing, it had come back to her. The officer wrote it down. Presley followed up 2 days later. Dorothy Ames met him at her front door with a plate of peanut butter cookies and a revised story. She wasn't sure no more, she said. It might have been the Henderson's second vehicle. It might have been a different day. She was getting older. Her memory wasn't what it used to be. She was sorry she couldn't be more helpful. Would he like some cookies for the road? Presley took the cookies. He drove away. He wrote in his notes, "Witness recanted." Why? He went back to see Dorothy Ames one more time, 3 weeks later, and found her reluctant to open the door. She spoke to him through the screen, arms crossed, voice polite but firm. She had nothing to add. She was sorry. She hoped the children were found safe. She died of a stroke in 1987. Whatever she had originally seen on that lane, whatever had made her hesitate before she took back her words, died with her. By October of 1980, the media coverage had faded. By the following spring, the tip line had gone quiet. The case moved from active to what investigators quietly called the long shelf. Cases that remained open in name, files maintained and occasionally reviewed, but for which no new leads had materialized. The town of Delwood moved on, the way small towns must. Carol Hargrove did not move on. She organized searches every year on the anniversary of the girl's disappearance. She appeared on television whenever anyone would have her. A local news segment, a true crime program in the early 90s, a brief mention in a national magazine. She sent letters to the GBI. She hired a private investigator, twice, spending money she didn't have. She papered other counties with flyers. She traveled to follow up on reported sightings. A woman in Tennessee who claimed to have seen 3 identical teenagers who might have been the girls. A tip from a man in Alabama that went nowhere. A phone call from Florida that turned out to be a cruel prank. She searched the world. Raymond stayed home. What happens to a marriage after you have lost 3 children? There is no good answer to that question, and anyone who gives you an easy one is lying. The grief alone is enough to collapse most things. The guilt, that automatic, irrational, merciless guilt of the parent who wasn't watching at exactly the right moment, is a weight that reshapes people from the inside. And when investigators circle a couple like wolves circling a fire, asking questions that imply things without saying them directly, the pressure on a relationship becomes nearly impossible to survive. Carol and Raymond Hargrove lasted 3 years after their daughters disappeared. By 1983, the silence between them had become its own kind of presence, a third occupant in the house on Cedar Mill Road. Carol would later describe those years as living inside a held breath. Raymond had stopped talking about the girls almost entirely. He went to work. He came home. He sat in his chair. He did not, to Carol's growing anguish, seem to be grieving in any way she recognized. She would bring up the girls, a memory, a question, a "what do you think happened?" And he would go still in that particular way she had first noticed when Detective Presley asked about the polygraph. Still and distant and carefully, completely quiet. It felt like talking to a wall that was listening, she would say, years later. Not a wall that wasn't there. A wall that was very much there and very much aware of every word I was saying. The divorce was finalized in the summer of 1983. Carol moved to Atlanta, then eventually north to Tennessee, chasing a job and then a second job and then finally, in her late 40s, a kind of fragile rebuilding of herself that was less like healing and more like learning to walk again after a long illness. Raymond stayed in the house on Cedar Mill Road. He did not move. He did not renovate. He did not sell. For 28 years, he lived in that house. He kept the shed in the backyard locked. He let the hedgerows grow high and unruly. He replaced the chain-link fence with a taller wooden one. Neighbors came and went. Children grew up and moved away. Dorothy Ames died. The Hendersons sold their property to a young couple who redid the kitchen and put in a swimming pool. And Raymond Hargrove sat in his house at the end of Cedar Mill Road. And he waited. He wasn't waiting for answers. He was waiting for everyone else to stop looking. Raymond Hargrove turned 62 in the spring of 2008. He had been retired for 2 years. He was not in good health. The kind of internal pressure a man carries for 28 years tends to express itself eventually, in the body, in the sleeplessness, in the way he had stopped answering the phone and started letting the mail pile up on the porch. The mail was the first sign that something had changed. Property tax notices, increasingly urgent letters from the county, a certified letter from a law firm that he signed for and then set on the kitchen table without opening. The house was in arrears. Raymond had stopped paying property taxes 18 months earlier, and the debt had accumulated with the patient inevitability of all bureaucratic processes. The county had begun foreclosure proceedings. He had, by any reasonable timeline, roughly 60 days to clear out the property or lose it entirely. He did nothing for 2 weeks. Then, on a Thursday morning in September of 2008, he walked out to the backyard for the first time in what neighbors later said seemed like years. He stood in the overgrown grass looking at the shed. The padlock on it was rusted from the outside but functional. He had the key on a ring he kept not in a drawer or on a hook but in his breast pocket, the way you keep something you cannot bear to put down but cannot bear to look at. He opened the shed. Inside was the accumulated sediment of 28 years of not dealing with things. Old lawn equipment, rusted garden tools, a broken bicycle, cardboard boxes that had softened and sagged in the humidity. Stacked against the far wall, behind a collapsed shelving unit, were the things from the girls' room that Carol had left when she moved out, things she could not take and could not throw away, things Raymond had put in the shed instead of looking at them. A bag of stuffed animals, a box of books, including a worn copy of Bedtime for Francis, 3 small pairs of patent leather shoes, still tied, placed together as though waiting to be put on. Raymond Hargrove sat down on the shed floor among these things and stayed there for a long time. Then he started going through the boxes. In the back of the shed, partially hidden beneath the collapsed shelving, was something else. Not a box. A trunk. Old, dark wood with tarnished metal clasps. The kind of thing that might have belonged to a grandparent. It was pushed back against the wall at an angle that suggested it had not been placed there casually. It had been placed there deliberately, shoved far back, positioned so that the shelving unit would need to be moved before anyone could reach it. Raymond Hargrove looked at the trunk for a long time. Then he reached for it. The clasp was stiff but not locked. He opened them with some effort, the metal protesting with a sound like a question. Inside the trunk were layers. A folded piece of canvas top on top. Beneath that, a stack of VHS videotapes in black plastic cases, no labels. Beneath those, a leather-bound journal, cracked along the spine. And at the very bottom, sealed with tape that had dried and yellowed but still held, a manila envelope. Written on the front in black marker, in handwriting he recognized as his own, June 1980. He sat in the shed doorway, the late September light falling in around him, and he opened the journal first. It took investigators later several days to fully reconstruct what the journal contained, working from Raymond's own account and from the journal itself after it was recovered. What follows is a condensed account of what was written in those pages, drawn from the record of the subsequent investigation. The journal began in January of 1980, 6 months before the girls disappeared. The early entries were almost mundane, work frustrations, notes about the weather, comments about the girls' development. But around March of 1980, around the time the triplets turned 6, the tone began to change. Raymond had been hiding something from Carol. He had been hiding it for nearly 2 years. In 1978, he had made a series of investments through a contact from his work, a scheme that promised steady, significant returns on relatively modest outlays. By the spring of 1980, the scheme had collapsed entirely. The contact had vanished. Raymond was left with a debt that amounted, in 1980 dollars, to just over $40,000. In today's money, closer to $150,000. He had told no one. He had continued going to work. He had continued coaching softball on Saturdays. He had continued appearing, to every person who looked at him, like a perfectly ordinary man who had nothing to hide. But the journal told a different story. In April of 1980, He had taken out 3 life insurance policies. One on Carol, one on himself, and a single policy that covered all 3 girls under one instrument, on Amber, Renee, and Maya. The payout on the girls' policy, in the event of their death, was $80,000. He had not opened the journal again after the summer of 1980. He had put it in the trunk and shoved the trunk behind the shelving and padlocked the shed and carried the key in his breast pocket every day for 28 years. Now he sat in the doorway of the shed, holding the journal, and the September light moved across the yard, and the birds made their unconcerned sounds in the hedgerows, and Raymond Hargrove made a sound that a neighbor later described as hearing through the fence. Not crying, exactly. Something lower than crying. Something that had been waiting, she said, for a very long time to come out. The VHS tapes did not have a player. Raymond had not owned a VCR since the early 90s. He drove to a pawn shop on the far side of town that still had one in the window, bought it for $12, and brought it home. He sat in the living room with the tapes for a long time before he put the first one in. The footage was exactly what you might expect from a home video made in the summer of 1980. It was grainy. The color had shifted to a greenish-yellow tint. The audio was slightly muffled, but the images were clear enough. The backyard on Cedar Mill Road. Sunlight. A sprinkler going. The 3 girls running through it in their swimsuits, screaming and laughing. Carol in the background on the porch steps, shading her eyes, smiling. And Raymond's voice behind the camera. He heard his own voice from 28 years ago, and something happened to his face that no one was there to see. On the tape, he was narrating the way a young father does, pointing out what each of the girls was doing, asking them to wave, calling them by name. Amber waved and looked serious. Renee waved and immediately ran away. Maya walked right up to the camera, too close, so her face filled the frame, and said something that the audio barely caught but that Raymond had apparently heard clearly enough to stop the tape and rewind it 3 times. Maya, at 6 years old, looking directly into the camera lens her father was holding, said, "Daddy, are we really going to move away soon?" Raymond's voice behind the camera, slow and careful, "Where did you hear that, baby?" Maya, already turning away to chase her sisters, "You said it. You and that man." The tape continued. The afternoon went on. The sprinkler went off and the girls dried themselves with beach towels and Carol came to gather them inside. The tape ran for another 3 minutes of empty backyard, just the swing moving in the breeze, before it ended. Raymond Hargrove sat in his living room for a very long time after the tape finished. Then he called 911. The GBI responded within the hour. The detective who took the initial call was a woman named Sandra Kowalski, 23 years into her career, who had heard of the Hargrove case as a matter of institutional history, one of those cases that was referenced in training discussions about what gets missed in the early days of an investigation. Raymond handed over the journal, the tapes, and the trunk without being asked. He sat in his own kitchen while investigators moved through his house and his shed, and he answered every question quietly and without a lawyer present, which later his public defender would describe as the most unfortunate decision he had made in a lifetime of unfortunate decisions. The manila envelope was opened in the presence of investigators that evening. Inside were 2 items. The first was a hand-drawn map. It showed a rough outline of a wooded property approximately 4 miles from Cedar Mill Road, a parcel of land that had belonged, investigators would confirm within 48 hours, to a man named Gerald Hargrove, Raymond's cousin, a man who had lived on the property briefly in the early 1980s and had died in a single-vehicle accident in 1981. The second item was a folded piece of notebook paper. On it, in Raymond's handwriting, was 7 words. 7 words that had been sealed in an envelope and buried in a trunk and locked behind a rusted padlock on a shed door for 28 years. "No one will ever find them, hey?" Detective Kowalski would later say that she had been in the room when the note was read, and that the most disturbing part was not the words themselves. It was that Raymond Hargrove, sitting at his own kitchen table, made no move to explain them. He simply looked at the table and nodded. once, as though he had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally find the right question. The GBI moved on the wooded property the following morning. Ground-penetrating radar equipment was brought in, technology that had not existed in 1980 and would have changed everything if it had. A team of forensic archaeologists set up a grid. The county coroner was notified. The property was heavily overgrown. Gerald Hargrove had made no improvements to it in the year or so he had used it, and the 27 years since his death had allowed the forest to reclaim most of what had once been cleared. The access road was barely possible. Investigators worked on foot through scrub brush and vine. The radar found 3 anomalies within 100 yards of the property's eastern tree line. The anomalies were consistent in depth and dimension, with shallow graves. The excavation took 4 days. On the second day, they found the first remains. On the third day, the second. On the fourth morning, early, with fog still sitting on the tree line and a cold October rain beginning to fall, they found the third. The remains were small. The soil had not been kind to them over 28 years. Forensic analysis would take several weeks, and throughout that time the GBI said nothing officially, releasing only a brief statement that human remains had been discovered and that the investigation into the 1980 disappearance of the Hargrove triplets was ongoing. But in Delwood, Georgia, and in the small apartment in Knoxville, Tennessee, where Carol Hargrove had been called by a victim's advocate the morning the remains were found, everyone already knew. DNA confirmation came 6 weeks later. The remains belonged to Amber, Renee, and Maya Hargrove. They had died in July of 1980. They were 6 years old. Raymond Hargrove was arrested in October of 2008. He was 62 years old. He did not resist. He said nothing to the officers who came to the house on Cedar Mill Road. He allowed himself to be handcuffed and walked to the cruiser and driven away from the house where he had lived for 28 years above the evidence of what he had done. The investigation that followed was one of the most painstaking the GBI had conducted in decades, precisely because so much time had passed. What investigators assembled came from multiple sources: financial records that had been archived and could be retrieved, interviews with surviving witnesses and former colleagues, the physical evidence from the trunk, and a gradually expanding picture drawn from Raymond's own eventual statements after he was appointed counsel. The financial picture was damning. Raymond had been in deep debt by early 1980. The investment scheme had left him with obligations he could not meet. The life insurance policies, including the one on the girls, had been purchased with remarkable timing, weeks before the disappearance. A cash withdrawal from a joint checking account, made 3 days after the girls vanished, was significant enough in 1980 terms to have been notable had anyone been looking at his finances in those first weeks. No one was. Gerald Hargrove, the cousin, had been largely unknown to anyone in Raymond's social circle. He was a distant relation. They shared a grandfather, who had resurfaced in Raymond's life in early 1980 when Raymond, desperate, had reached out to family contacts he had not seen in years. Gerald was, by available accounts, a man who had lived his life at the margins of legitimate employment and who had connections that someone in Raymond's position might have found useful and terrible at the same time. The payment trail, pieced together from bank records, pointed to a transaction in the days following the disappearance. Gerald Hargrove had received a significant sum. Investigators believed it was in the range of $10,000 in 1980 money, deposited into an account under a different name that he had used for other transactions. Gerald had died in his car accident in March of 1981. His death had been ruled accidental. No one had connected him to the Hargrove case. He had taken whatever he knew to his grave, or so it had appeared. But Raymond had kept the map. He had kept the note. He had kept the tape. He had sealed them in an envelope and locked them in a trunk, and lived for 28 years on a street where children played and neighbors waved and the ordinary world went on and on and on. Why did he keep them? This is the question investigators returned to again and again. Keeping the evidence was an enormous risk. It made no rational sense. A man who wanted to escape justice permanently would have destroyed everything. The forensic psychologist who evaluated Raymond offered a theory, presented during pretrial proceedings, that generated considerable discussion. That Raymond Hargrove had kept the evidence not despite his guilt but because of it. That somewhere beneath the 28 years of stillness and waiting, there was a part of him that had put those things in a trunk and sealed an envelope and written a note precisely because he could not allow what had happened to simply disappear entirely. That the trunk in the shed was not a hiding place. It was a confession, waiting for the day when someone, even if that someone was only himself, would finally be willing to open it. In the months that followed Raymond's arrest, journalists and investigators and retired law enforcement officers who had worked the case went back through the 1980 files with a particular, painful clarity of hindsight. The polygraph refusal. Presley had noted it and moved on because there was nothing he could do with a note. The financial records. No one had subpoenaed them in the early investigation because there was no evidence pointing toward the parents specifically enough to justify that step. The investigation had focused outward, on strangers, on predators, on the possibility of abduction, because that was the narrative that fit the absence of physical evidence. The insurance policies. Filed, legitimate, invisible unless you were specifically looking for them. Dorothy Ames and her recanted story, whatever she had seen on the lane that afternoon. The dark truck, a person she recognized, something that made her change her mind when she sat down and thought about what it would mean to tell the truth, had been the closest the investigation came to a break in those early weeks. And then it was gone. The shed, locked for 28 years, visible from the lane, never examined without a warrant that no one ever had sufficient probable cause to seek. Walt Presley, the original lead investigator, was 71 years old when Raymond was arrested. He had retired a decade earlier. When a reporter called him for comment, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I looked at that house many times. I drove past Cedar Mill Road more times than I can count, 4 years after the case went cold. And that shed was always there, always padlocked. And I never," he paused. "We are trained to follow evidence. And when there isn't any, you're left with feelings. And feelings aren't enough. They were never going to be enough." He paused again. "But I've thought about that shed a lot over the years. I've thought about it a lot." Carol Hargrove was 60 years old when she received the call that human remains had been found on a wooded property 4 miles from the house where her daughters had disappeared. She had been at work. She was a bookkeeper at a small accounting firm in Knoxville. She had built her second life carefully and without fanfare. An apartment she kept clean, a cat she had named Francis, a small garden of tomatoes and herbs on the back patio. She had not remarried. She had not stopped searching, exactly, but the searching had changed shape over the decades, becoming less active and more constant, the way grief does when it has lived with you long enough to become part of your furniture. She drove herself to Georgia. She did not contact Raymond. She did not go to the house on Cedar Mill Road. She sat in a motel room near the GBI field office for 3 days while investigators confirmed what everyone already understood. She met with Detective Kowalski. She provided DNA samples. She answered questions she had been waiting nearly 30 years to be asked. When the DNA confirmation came, Carol was in Knoxville. She received a phone call from Kowalski, and then she sat in her apartment for a very long time. The cat climbed into her lap. The tomatoes on the patio needed watering. She has spoken publicly about that day only once, at a press conference in the spring of 2009 held outside the courthouse where Raymond's trial was set to begin. She was not a woman given to dramatic statements. She was a schoolteacher's daughter, composed and precise with language. She had prepared what she wanted to say, and she said it without reading from notes. "I spent nearly 30 years searching for my daughters. I looked in every direction. I followed every lead. I went wherever anyone told me they might be. I searched the world for them." She paused. The press assembled on the courthouse steps was very quiet. "I never thought I needed to search my own home." She thanked the investigators who had worked the case. She thanked Detective Kowalski. She did not mention Raymond by name. She said that she hoped the trial would bring whatever justice could be brought after so much time. And then she walked back to the car that was waiting for her, and she went back to Tennessee, and she did not speak publicly again. The trial of Raymond Hargrove began in March of 2009 and lasted 11 days. He was charged with 3 counts of murder in the first degree, 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder, and fraud charges related to the insurance policies. Gerald Hargrove, the cousin who had died in 1981, was identified in the prosecution's case as a co-conspirator who had acted as an intermediary, the person who had taken the girls from the property in exchange for payment, who had transported them to the wooded land that he owned, and who had ensured they would never be found. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the documentary evidence from the trunk, the journal, the financial records subpoenaed from archived bank records, the insurance policies, the map, the note, the videotape on which Maya Hargrove, 6 years old, looked into her father's camera and asked if it was true they were going to move away soon. That tape was played in the courtroom. Every person present reported that the silence in the room during those few minutes was unlike anything they had experienced in a legal proceeding. The judge called a 10-minute recess after it was played. The court reporter left the room. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the note was ambiguous, that the map could be explained by a prior relationship with the cousin. They argued that Raymond, by calling 911 and surrendering the evidence voluntarily, had demonstrated a conscience rather than guilt. They argued that a man who had lived for 28 years on Cedar Mill Road, who had not fled, who had not disposed of the evidence, who had finally, at the last possible moment, made the call that led investigators to his daughters, was not the cold-blooded monster the prosecution was describing. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. Raymond Hargrove was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms with no possibility of parole. At the sentencing, he made a brief statement. He did not express remorse in the way that sentencing statements usually do, with tears and formal language about how sorry he was. He simply stood and said, in a voice that several courtroom observers described as very calm, "I know what I did. I have known every day of my life what I did. There is no amount of time in prison that approaches what I've already served." The judge did not respond to this. He read the sentence. Raymond Hargrove was led from the courtroom. Amber, Renee, and Maya Hargrove were buried together in a small cemetery in Delwood, Georgia, in the winter of 2009, 28 years after they disappeared. Carol was there. She had chosen the plot and the headstone herself. She had written the words that appear on the stone, which are simple, their names, their birth date, and a line that reads, "They were always together." A small number of people attended. Former neighbors from Cedar Mill Road. Walt Presley, the retired detective, who drove 4 hours to be there. Sandra Kowalski, who stood at the back and left before the reception. A woman who had been a classmate of Carol's in college, who had driven from North Carolina. The girls had last been seen on a July afternoon in 1980, running through a sprinkler in the backyard of the house where their father waited for everyone to stop looking. They were buried on a cold February morning 29 years later, in the ground of the state where they had lived their entire lives. 6 years old. 3 little girls. Each one someone who had wanted something from the world. Maya with her curiosity and her questions. Renee with her fearless running, Amber with her serious, watchful eyes. 3 whole lives that had lasted only 6 years and had then been taken, deliberately, for $80,000 and a chance to avoid a debt. The house on Cedar Mill Road was sold after the foreclosure proceedings concluded. The new owners renovated extensively. They tore down the old shed and put up a newer, larger one. They painted the trim a different color. The backyard looks different now, but there is still a gate in the fence at the back of the yard. On windy afternoons, it moves. Every true crime story arrives eventually at a place where the facts run out and the questions remain. Why did Raymond keep the evidence? Was it guilt that could not fully extinguish itself, or something stranger, an inability to let go of the only documentation that the girls had ever existed in his life beyond their photographs. The forensic psychologist's theory was compelling but incomplete. Human beings who do terrible things are rarely simple, and the man who locks evidence in a trunk and carries the key in his breast pocket for 28 years is not a simple man. Why did Dorothy Ames change her story? That question died with her, and it has the quality of all unanswered questions in cases like this. The nagging sense that if you could just go back and sit with her on that porch one more time, ask the right question in the right way, something important would emerge from the particular silence she was protecting. How does a town fail to see what is happening within it? Delwood, Georgia was not unusual in this. Small towns protect their own in ways that are not always conscious. The reluctance to believe something terrible of a familiar face, the unwillingness to sustain suspicion without proof, the way a padlocked shed becomes invisible when you have seen it every day for 20 years. And there is the largest question, the one that resists any clean answer. How do you weigh the 28 years that Amber, Renee, and Maya Hargrove did not have against the fact that their father eventually, however imperfectly, led investigators to them? Is that redemption? Is it something less than that? Is it simply a man who could not carry the weight any longer and found a way to set it down that preserved the appearance of choice? Justice arrived in Delwood, Georgia in 2009. It arrived late, imperfect, and irrevocably incomplete. 3 lives cannot be returned. A mother cannot have back 3 decades of searching the wrong direction. The years do not refill themselves. But the girls were found. They were named. They were buried together, as they had lived. Someone read the words on the stone and understood what they meant. They were always together. In the end, it is not the conviction that stays with you. It is the image on that grainy videotape. A 6-year-old girl walking toward her father's camera with complete trust, her face filling the frame, asking a question whose answer she did not yet understand and would not live long enough to know. "Daddy, are we really going to move away soon?" She was smiling when she asked it. That is the detail that stays. That is the detail that will stay for a very long time. Do you think justice delayed is still justice? What warning signs did investigators miss? Please subscribe for more stories that uncover the truth.